Hello, you're not going to get those 2 minutes back, it's me, and I love to talk about psychosocial hazards, so it's going to be hard to get me to stop. However, I'm going to do my best to keep it within 30 minutes. Now, Jordan showed us all a definition of psychosocial hazard, so this should be simple. Who's going to volunteer? What is a psychosocial hazard? And tell everyone. For those that went exactly as planned, no one put their hands up. Would anyone know how to define bullying? I thought I'd see more hands. Yeah, good, yeah. And I think the reason is, and no shame in that, the reason psychosocial hazards are so hard to define is that, first of all, it covers a much broader range of subjects than just bullying, but also it is a relatively new term. We've only had this in place really for a few years. And you could be forgiven for thinking this is a hazard which is quite new to us as regulators. But as you just heard, I've been regulating in this space for 15 years, so in the spirit of the fabulous Welcome to Country speaker, Robin Collard, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about, I think it's that one, is I press? Or this one? Oh, I did it, good. This is a story of Kath Jones. It's an inspector when she was in general industries many years ago. I think this was taken from a video in 2009. And I'd go into the workplaces with my clipboard and my grumpy inspector's face there, and I would be armed with the OSH Act, which I had at the time. My colleagues at Resources Safety at the time, they had the Mine Safety Inspection Act, but they both were very similar in they had a general duty of care component. They were both parts of legislation that were absolutely designed for physical hazards, or for hazards which were going to harm your physical health. So it took a little bit of craft. It took some bit of regulatory craft to apply these laws to psychosocial hazards, and so a lot of us needed qualifications in psychology and related fields in order to be effective in this space. But luckily, back in 2010, we had a code of practice on violence, aggression and bullying. This was fantastic. We were the first jurisdiction, by the way, in Australia to have a code of practice on this. And this really helped me because finally we had a definition of a behaviour that could cause harm to health. We knew that bullying was a hazard. But for these reasons, they weren't called psychosocial inspections. We called them bullying inspections. So armed with my act and my regulations and my code of practice, I'd walk into a workplace, and as with today, you can't see psychosocial hazards. You very rarely go in and see bullying or violence happening. You have to ask a lot of questions. And this is why I'm good at the job. I love talking. And you speak to the workers and you speak to the employers, and you'd ask a series of questions. First of all, you'd establish who the employer is. That was pretty simple. It was the person who paid the workers. You'd ask, have any workers reported bullying? So I needed to form an opinion as to whether there was a hazard. So I'd ask, have there been any reports? And if they haven't been reported, what has the employer done to look for this hazard before or in the absence of reports? And then I'd look at the controls that were in place, the policies, the procedures, how well they were working. And if I felt they weren't working, I would consider if those controls were effective. Now, I think I've jumped a gun there. The investigations, of course, we always look at as well to see whether or not they were effective in finding the hazard. So let's fast forward to 2020, and the new Act came in, and as you can see, it made me much happier as an inspector. I suddenly got to go into the workplace because this new Act that we were armed with, which was the Work Health and Safety legislation, finally said, oh, by the way, health is both physical and psychological. This was great. So finally we could say we had more meat. We didn't need so much regulatory craft. We could start to apply the hazards a bit more easily. And my counterparts or my colleagues in mine safety also had this act as well. But we've had slightly different regulations for the different workplaces. So general industries and mining and petroleum industries have slight differences in the regulations. But just like with the previous Act, I still relied on codes of practice, and neither of these acts or regulations mentioned psychosocial. That word didn't exist. Not until we got this amazing code of practice, and again, WA was the first jurisdiction to get it. Go us, we're pretty good, I think. Finally, this defined a psychosocial hazard, and this code of practice said, well, we're not looking just at bullying. And anyone who's familiar with the code of practice will see there's 20 different hazards and risk factors listed here. It goes well beyond bullying now. We also had other codes of practice underlying it on workplace behaviours, on violence and aggression. So finally, I'd go in and armed with this information, I'd again go in and ask questions because, again, you can't see this hazard, you have to find out. So this time I'd go into workplace with a notebook. I've gone up in the world, I no longer use a clipboard. And with my notebook, I'd say, okay, who is the person in control of a business or undertaking? This is a bit more complicated now because not only are there many, many PCBUs well beyond an employer, but there could be multiple PCBUs who hold the same duty. And when you hold the same duty, it doesn't diminish if two people have got it. You don't half-half. You've got to establish who the different PCBUs are. Now, I worked in general industries, as was mentioned, but I've also worked in mining, and in all cases you will see multiple different PCBUs. It could even be the person who controls the building, if it's a case of violence and aggression. It could be the contractor, it could be the mine operator, it could be an accommodation manager. So you have to establish who that is. Then you work out, is there a hazard here? Is there a psychosocial hazard? Now I have to form a reasonable belief. And as Dean said, we can assume that anywhere that people work together, there's a likelihood of psychosocial hazards. Unless you're a single operator, it's pretty unlikely you're going to be exposed to bullying. Although I have actually done a bullying investigation on a single-person operation before, which didn't end well. Anyway, that was in the past, and here we are. And so if people haven't, reported psychosocial hazards, how do I establish if somebody's been exposed to a psychosocial hazard? Well, I will ask people, and I will look at reports, and I'll go through some of that in a minute. And I'd ask if the PCBU, what have you done to identify these hazards? If you don't think they exist, as Dean said, you're probably living on a cloud, but also you do have a duty to identify it. It is written in our laws, and you need to assess those risks to understand why they're occurring, because we know that behaviours don't occur in isolation. We're products of our environment. So I'd also look at, like before, what controls are in place, and now I ask, has the PCBU reviewed these controls? I'm no longer telling them myself, is it effective or not? The PCBU has to show me they have reviewed those controls to see they're effective. And of course, with the new Act came this positive duty of care where there is a due diligence on officers. So you can't assume that you don't know about the hazard. You have to keep up to date with the hazards in your workplace. You have to know what the controls are and see what you're doing in order to put them in place. So with this, how do we apply them then? Well, the key changes between the two, beyond my hair changing colour, was you've got a different terminology, obviously, workers, employees are now workers, employer, PCBU. That's pretty simple. You've also got that positive duty of care. So the PCBU now has to prove more, that they are being more proactive in that space. But I think the key difference has been we are no longer now looking at bullying and violence. We are now looking at all psychosocial hazards, which means the scope of our inquiries has really increased. So, to the golden question, what is the psychosocial hazard? Well, we have a code of practice, and you all would have read it, and we've now got it in our legislation. But basically, as Jordan showed in his slide, we've already got that definition. It's anything at work that could cause harm to your physical or psychological health. That's pretty widespread, isn't it? Generally, though, we're looking at inappropriate behaviours, which are listed there, but there could also be factors such as if you work in emotionally demanding work, we know that there's a risk of burnout. If you have very high job demands and low job control, there's a risk of fatigue, shifts, and there's all sorts of other factors which need to be considered when you're controlling them. So how do I regulate? Well, as of 2020, we got the new laws come in, and again, as I said, they didn't mention psychosocial, but so I just used that general duty of care, and that general duty of care hasn't really changed all that much. It basically says you've got to manage risks so far as is reasonably practicable. There is also a duty of care, of course, on workers by an act or omission not harming anybody else, and we know with violence and aggression and bullying, often if there are workers involved, there could be a breach there. There were also underpinning these in the original regulations, the risk management regulations, and they are you identifying the hazards? Are you controlling them? Are you reviewing them? They are still in place. And we also have regulations specifically on training and what training should be there, and also on the facilities. And in mining, again, now I'm working in mines, this has become much more important with accommodation facilities, particularly in lighting and safe movement of people. But certainly that would be the case for hospital settings, prisons, where you have people working with a risk of violence and aggression. Now, that was 2020, but last year, something rather wonderful happened, and we got the new regulations came in December last year, and that, first of all, it defined psychosocial hazard. So finally we had the definition in there. And that really assisted us. As I said, we've still got the other regulations, but this was added to it. And with the definition came much more prescription over how to control it. And so now the PCBU has very clear direction to say you must consider the duration, the frequency, the severity. You must look at how the work has been designed. You must look at the layout. You think about the tools, and that could be the communication systems people have. You've got to consider how workplace behaviours interact. We know some behaviours are very protective. Great leadership support can make a huge difference, and I can attest to that myself. You can cope with a lot more when you know that you've got the support of your management. So that, what does that look like now when I go into a workplace? Well, imagine I get an incident. I might get a complaint from an employee, or I might get a notification from a PCBU. I would look at that incident in its lifespan. So I've got to think about what happened before, what happened during, and what factors impacted people at the time, and their health, and certainly what happened afterwards, because this is becoming more and more pertinent, particularly with gendered violence and more traumatic incidents. So the questions I ask will be looking for how I can form a reasonable belief that there is a hazard and that it is being controlled. So I'll ask for things like, what are the organisational controls in place? What are your policies and procedures? But also, how well are they applied? Are they trusted? Do people know them? I'll look at the environmental controls that are in place. That might be the lighting. It might be controlled access if you are dealing with members of public who are potentially unknown or have a risk. I'll also look at the training, of course. I have to consider the training, but not just the training for workers in the standards of behaviour, what we expect, but also what's the training provided to managers? Do managers have training in how to give performance management conversations? Do they feel comfortable with having difficult discussions? We see a lot of issues coming up with bullying versus performance management. And very often I'll ask the supervisor, have you ever had any training in how to have a difficult conversation? You're setting them up to fail. Managers are workers too. So that training is really important, and also training in how to respond, but we'll talk about that in a second. During the incident, yes, there are factors that might impact a person. For example, if it's witnessed by other people, do they know how to intervene? Do they know what de-escalation strategies could be used if they feel safe to do so? And that's absolutely important. But also, do they know how to report it? Do they feel comfortable with the reporting system? Is the reporting system fit for purpose? Or is it still paper-based? Is it known by everybody? And is there trust in that system? You can measure that trust utilising surveys, using focus groups, etc. Finally, I look after the incident. What happened immediately after the incident? If there was an incident and I spoke to my manager and that manager said, you know what, that's just Sally, that's just how she speaks, and it was a minor incident and it's brushed off. By the way, Sally would never speak that way, so my apologies, I just saw her face. But we look at what kind of response is provided to people by the manager, and that trauma-informed response actually is important, and we're seeing it more and more. So not only are you controlling with the risk of vicarious trauma or secondary trauma after somebody reports something to you. A minor case can absolutely explode into a post-traumatic stress disorder if you don't get the right response from a manager immediately. But also, are you sending someone straight back into a hazard area without considering the controls? And I've seen many examples where people have said, thanks for the report, now just go back straight in there and we won't talk to anybody. We also, of course, look at the investigations. Investigations come up a lot, and Dean was asked a few questions about them. A work health and safety investigation is not the same as an investigation looking for substantiating or not. We're not looking at disciplinary action. It's a no-blame system of work health and safety investigation. So we'll be looking at the factors that caused the incident. And remember what those factors were? They're the duration, the frequency. They're whether the hazards were interacting or combining. They're the design. These are the factors we want to see in your investigation. So when I ask for an investigation, I want to see that you've considered how that one incident, for example, of harassment, how does it fit in the bigger picture? And whether or not there were other design or environment issues, and I'm going to show you examples of those because it might not seem in place, but again, that's what we're looking for. And finally, I'll look at how have you reviewed your controls? Have you considered, are they working? Are they fit for purpose? As Jordan pointed out, do you set and leave, or do you actually go back and go, oh, I don't think that's working so well anymore? And of course, we'd look at other issues like the emotional support that's provided. If somebody has experienced a traumatic event, we know that giving them a card for an EAP rarely works very well. So that's much more than sending somebody away. I won't labour this point because I know it's already been discussed. But that's what I look at. And so when you look at those boxes that are surrounding the pre-incident and post-incident, I'm going to be asking for documents, and I'll ask questions that show me those things in the boxes. That's what I ask for when I go to a workplace now, before I go. And I'm going to show you an example of some compliance action I've taken. Bearing in mind, I know you want your lunch, so I'm going to fly through. But I'm going to show you a picture of, which will look familiar for those who work in the mining sector, and apologies again for those who work in general industries. I've got two camps here, but I'm going to talk about an incident that occurred in a camp that was on the right-hand side there. Yeah. And this incident involved a young female worker who was contracted as a cleaner, and she was cleaning a room, and before she walked into the room, she was exposed to some very sexualised comments, and as she came out of the room, she was touched inappropriately by a gentleman outside the room, and it led to quite a significant psychosocial injury for her. She was a very young worker, and she was also culturally linguistically diverse, which I don't mean that she's at higher risk, but there are added risks associated with finding support when it comes to that. And when I looked at this case, there were a lot of failures noticed, that I noted. But I'm showing the picture on the left because I want to highlight just the risks associated with layout, because some people forget about layout. The picture on the left shows an accommodation setting that's been really well designed because there's natural surveillance. Have you seen the curvature? So I can actually look down a corridor and I can see a few more doorways. I can also look across the camp and I can see people moving. The other site where it occurred, there was absolutely no natural surveillance. Each room also has a window, you'll notice, and the accommodation setting where this incident occurred had no windows, no lockable fly screen. There was no way of seeing what's going on outside of the room unless you open the door. So there's no safe surveillance. And the other thing I wanted to point out, it's very hard to see in that picture on the right, but there's very good lighting. There's a big lighting tower that lights up the whole of that walkway. So I wanted to show you the difference because I'm going to show you an improvement notice that I wrote after this incident. Now, I know that you're not going to be able to read it, so don't worry. I'm just showing you this in case you've never been issued an improvement notice so you can see what they look like. So again, there were multiple PCBUs. The mine operator. Now, they had already started making arrangements and changes to their accommodation, so I just provided recommendations there. However, there was a contracting cleaner, and so they were responsible for the communication systems provided to the cleaner. She had no walkie-talkie or any means of telling somebody, I'm feeling a bit unsafe, before she went into the room. She had nothing. She also had no clear instruction as to who to call and what to do to report. And her employer had not assessed the risk of the environment at all. They hadn't even considered it. There was another PCBU involved as well, and that was the contractor of the subject. Now, out of interest, you might ask, why did the subject not get a notice? He'd been stood down. Now, the injury that occurred was not significant enough for a prosecution, so I can only write an improvement notice. But I can only write an improvement notice to employees or workers. That person's been stood down or dismissed, they're no longer a worker. So if you're asking why I'm not giving these notices to workers, it's because they get dismissed. So I can't do anything. I have to go back to the PCBU, bearing in mind, of course, the mine operator has the primary duty of care. It still lays with the PCBU, not so much with the workers, but just in case you were wondering why the worker didn't get any notice. So what I found was that the contracting cleaner had some risk controls in place. They had a policy, and they had a reporting system, but it was filling out a form. This worker was culturally, linguistically diverse. She actually didn't have very good literacy, and it was not fit for purpose. They had failed, though, to consider the layout and where this person would be working. She was alone. She did not have a buddy, and she didn't have the systems in place, so they didn't pick that up. So under this new regulation, it said you had to look at the controls and you have to consider all the sources of risk, which includes the layout and design. Remember that from the regulations? So that's an example of a notice that I've written under these new psychosocial regulations. I'm briefly going to show you one more. This is a case of, again, you're not going to be able to read the words. You can see how many words there are because you have to write the reasonable belief in these notices, so apologies if it's long and lengthy. In this case, there was of course it's a mine site because I work in mines now, but there had been multiple occupational violence and aggression incidents, physical violence, lots of altercations, and again, there were multiple PCBUs because there were multiple contractors involved. The PCBU had failed to consider all the factors behind that, and one of the factors here was the instruction that was provided to people. And this is where the multiple PCBUs sharing the same duty, I want to explain. One contractor said, we don't need to train our workers, that's the mine operator's job. And the mine operator said, no, we don't train those workers. They work for the construction company, so they're only in and out for a day, so we don't train. So there was a gap in the training where people didn't understand that a shared duty of care doesn't mean it's shared by half. You still have that same duty. So I went and examined both the mine operator and the contractor, and I looked at all the training and information that was provided. There was some training, but there was very insufficient detail on the behaviours. They had a code of conduct that said just respect people and don't get drunk. Didn't really tell me anything about the risks associated with potentially hazardous behaviours and how we can control them. There's, by the way, a lot of guidance on what you should do for training in the Code of Practice on Workplace Behaviours. So if you're wondering what needs to be included in training, please go to that Code of Practice. I'll show that in a minute. So the notice was to review the training and also to look at, to consider what the controls are. So when you train somebody in the behaviours, you don't just say, don't sexually harass people. You look at the controls that could be in place to avoid it. Talk about the potential of power imbalances, the gender imbalances, the fact that people who are in minorities are at a higher risk. Talk about how you might actually have what we call an unconscious bias, where you just assume that somebody who is a man and middle-aged and white is in a position of power. You need to review all the training so it includes this, and even informed consent is now being included in training. By the way, there was a question about these things. We're even seeing that included in training now. And as I said, I've put it up there. So yeah, if you're not sure, that Code of Practice on Workplace Behaviours will list what you need to do. So just to summarise, because I've shown you a couple of notices, look, we know that psychosocial hazards are a little bit complex, but the fact is it hasn't changed. You still have to identify them. You can't just wait for them to be reported. You have to control them so far as is reasonably practicable. And now, with the new regulations, we're very prescriptive on that. We tell you how to control it. So we're going to be issuing notices if you are not controlling and considering those factors which were outlined earlier. And I understand it's complex, but that's why we have so much wonderful guidance, and I would really strongly encourage you to utilise these codes of practice. We have 3 codes of practice on psychosocial hazards, We have guidance notes on gendered violence for sexual harassment and sexual assault. It covers that risk management process. It gives some detail on controls. We've got a lot more information. And so if you're not already signed up to our newsletter, please do it, because you will actually get you'll get a notification if there's any new information product come out. And look, I've managed to make it so that you will have your 2 minutes back for lunch. Thank you for your time, and I really just want to say I'm very encouraged by all the people here. As an inspector who's been around for a long time, this is a bit of a zeitgeist moment with psychosocial hazards, but I don't think we would have had this number of people turn up back in 2009 when I tried to talk about bullying. So thank you for coming along, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.